For this video, we're going to walk through setting up a FusionAuth connector. We're going to cover what's the use case for a connector and why it would be useful for your business. And we're going to show you how to actually set that up and configure that within FusionAuth and connect that to your own potential application. What is the reason or use case for a connector? Well, in most use cases, a connector is used for a migration from an existing data store to moving that over to FusionAuth. Connectors can be long-standing, but they are typically used for migration. Pretty good use case is if you have an existing homegrown Auth solution, and maybe you have some custom attributes that you might want to migrate to FusionAuth. Well, with a connector, you can simply have that API sit in front of a login page. Those credentials are then passed down to your application where you can further handle logic of doing a user lookup within your own data store. And then you can simply give FusionAuth or yes or no if you want to be able to finish with moving that user over to FusionAuth. So it's a pretty straightforward use case, and we can walk you through right now how to actually set that up. So right now we're looking at our admin UI within FusionAuth, and that's the best way to demonstrate how this connector API works. So if we go to settings and then we click on connectors, we have the ability to create a new connector. So let's just do one from scratch. There's different types of connectors that you can use within FusionAuth. For example, you have the ability, if you were using Active Directory, depending on the Active Directory that you are using, you potentially could use what's called an LDAP connector. But for most use cases, you're going to set up a generic connector. There's also the FusionAuth connector, and that's the default connector that's being used when there's no migration being completed. So here's our settings to just configure a generic connector. So you have the ability to name this connector whatever you want. We're going to name this one migration test. Next, we have the authentication URL. Now, this is important. This authentication URL is going to point FusionAuth to what endpoint that you are going to be handling the validation for the user that is being passed through that request. So we'll look at what a request looks like from FusionAuth and what to expect so you know how to set up your endpoint. But we want to be essentially point this to your own application, or if we're doing a homegrown solution, or potentially the endpoint that where your users actually live. So we're going to set this up. We have a Node.js app set up at localhost 3000. And just for information here, we do have a locally installed FusionAuth instance on a Docker image. So whenever we're using a Docker, there's a special bridge, so we can't officially use our localhost 3000 per se. So what we're going to do is just type in http://host.docker internal. And this is essentially the equivalent of hitting localhost 3000. And the endpoint that we're going to set up is migrate-user. You also have the ability to set up custom timeouts. Now this is going to set up the timeout based on how long FusionAuth is supposed to wait for the request to come back. You typically don't want to set that over 2 seconds, but we'll leave that at the default. And typically when you're setting up any type of configuration for testing purposes, it's a good practice to turn on debugging. Just remember to turn debugging off for your actual production, but it's good to be able to look at event logs if there's some type of error that you're having within the FusionAuth system. You do also have the ability to set up security for your endpoint. So if you want to make sure that this API that we're sending this request to is locked down, you definitely have the ability to set up auth headers. And if you want to set any arbitrary headers in addition to the authentication headers, you have that ability to do that as well. So we'll go ahead and hit save. And from there, we want to go and set up our connector policies. So connector policies are configured at the tenant. So if we click on tenants and then we click on our default tenant, we already have it set up right here, but the connector policy is essentially an order of operations that FusionAuth will check to which connector will it hit first before proceeding to the next. So we want to add a connector policy, and then we'll set this to the migration test. You do also have the ability to set up a custom domains or a list of domains if you want to be able to check against that before the connector proceeds. However, we're just going to leave the asterisk there for a wildcard. And since we are setting this up for migration, we obviously want to toggle the migrate user to true. Okay. Once again, this is set up as an order of operations, so we want to move this up to the top, and then we'll hit save. Next things that we want to do is actually set up our endpoint. So how the connector API works is you would put this in front of your login page, and essentially when a user enters their credentials, username and password, that sends a post request down to the endpoint of your choosing. And from that endpoint, you have the ability to choose, handle the logic, look up the user within your own database, and then you're giving the FusionAuth API either a 200 response, meaning that it was successful and you want to go ahead and migrate the user, or if you cannot find that user within your database, you would send a 404 response. And that's kind of included in our documentation right here. I have that's already pulled up. You want to be able to create a user object that you're sending to FusionAuth, and then you're going to give it a yes or no by the response code if you're going to move forward with that successful authentication and migration of the user. So when the connector API sends a post request down to your application, this is essentially what the request is going to look like. The three things that we typically are paying attention for this demonstration is a login ID, password, and application ID. Login ID represents either a username or email for the user. The password is the password. And the application ID is the ID that the user is logging into. So that's going to be which application that is registered to within FusionAuth. So when we're setting up our endpoint, we want to be able to check these things so we can validate it and then send it back to FusionAuth. So let's go to our Node application and show you what that kind of looks like. So here's the route that I have. Once again, this is a Node.js app sitting at localhost 3000, and the route is migrate-user. And this is very simple code here. Is not production, but this just illustrates how you would essentially set this up. So we're checking the response and we're building the user object based on the request that we received. So there's a couple things that FusionAuth is expecting back in the response back to the connector API. So number one, you want to make sure that you have user.email or user.username filled out. So essentially we're taking the request that's coming in and we're just echoing that back in the response. Also, you want to make sure that you have the user.id. When you're creating a user within FusionAuth, it requires you to have a unique 36 character UUID. For the purposes of migration, you have the ability to create a new one. So that's just a simple JavaScript method that you have the ability to do. From there, those are the only two required fields, but suggestions that you definitely want to include, especially if you're migrating your user over to FusionAuth, there's obviously some demographics or different fields that you may need to persist to FusionAuth as well. So a good way to do that is through what's called the user.data field. So the user.data field can hold any arbitrary data that you want. So for this example, we have a custom ID set to the value of 123-ABC. We also may want to put a custom field of migrated true. That just tells you that you can do some further lookup logic if that user has actually migrated. And then we just have a foo bar array that has 2 strings of foo and bar. So this can represent any type of data that you want. Customers can put complex objects nested within these user.data fields. And the good thing about FusionAuth is you can use Elasticsearch to index and search within these user.data objects. The next strongly suggested field that you want to include in your response back to FusionAuth is the application ID, and that's located in the registrations array, which is located right here. So essentially, we're just taking that from the response and echoing that back into the user object when we're building that. And then there's also other fields that you want to reference to our user API documentation when you're setting up the user object, but we also have the ability to put phone number, first name, last name, many more fields that you can populate, but just want to keep this short and simple. From there, you have the ability to send to FusionAuth essentially a yes or yes, we found the user, we were able to look them up within a database, and we are going to send a 200 response with the user object back to FusionAuth. Else, or you could set a 404 response. No, we did not locate this user, or no, there was some type of error. We're going to send a 404 response or a no back to FusionAuth, and FusionAuth will essentially fail that request. So that's essentially it. If we go back to our FusionAuth application, let's go ahead and get that set up. So we're going to go ahead and open a incognito browser, and let's hit our localhost 3000. Now, if we hit login, that's going to start the OAuth flow, and we're going to create a user. We're going to assume that this user is located in your database and essentially that you look up the user and that is a successful authentication. And then we're going to set the password to password123. Now, when we hit submit, we have a successful authentication. It says hello migrated, and let's actually look at the user and see if that was actually created with the Fusion. So if we go to users, we actually have this new user. Name is migrated user, and now that was created within. So let's inspect this further. We see that this user is now registered to our test application because that was passed on from FusionAuth in the request with the application ID. And then if we click on user.data, we now have these custom attributes that are stored on the user object. So you can have whatever that you want. We have a custom ID. We have an array of foo bar, which has two arbitrary strings of foo and bar. And then once again, this migrated true claim was also passed as well. What's great here is that we also was able to create a custom UUID that FusionAuth accepted and stored that on the user object as well as the phone number here. So that is the use case for a connector. I appreciate you watching, and I hope this helps. Thanks.